Martin Gurri, thank you for being here today.
Happy to be here.
Um, just for the people that are listening that may not know who you are, could you please share a bit about your background for those who might not know you?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I was born in Cuba, Havana. Before I was 10 years old, I had lived through a right-wing dictatorship and a left-wing totalitarianism. Um, Gladly and thankfully, my parents, bailed out from that situation and joined that what was at the time a large migration. There's another one right now, by the way, but a
Mm,
large migration of Cubans out of the island into Miami.
mhm.
So I was happy about that. I was also happy that my father found a job in Washington, D.C., so he got us out of the Cuban ghetto in Miami. So I grew up, essentially at that time, I know it seems inconceivable right now, I was this very odd duck, an immigrant from some rare, a rare country, Cuba. So I grew up without the burden of having lots of immigrants. There was no crisis about that. It was actually an
Mm,
extraordinarily good experience. Um, I went to school here in Virginia, and that's an interesting story too. I arrived here, and it was still Jim Crow. All right, it was just the
mm,
tail end of Jim Crow. We can talk about that if you want. Um, and went to school here, signed on that's with CIA through a very strange process where they put out an ad in the paper, and about 10 different people pointed me to the ad, and I said, what the hell are you talking about? CIA, that's crazy. And sure enough, I went in there and had a long, wonderful career at CIA. At which point, and I was an analyst of global media. And so I happened to be, I get a lot of credit for predicting things, but really you can't predict. It's impossible. But if you're lucky and you're standing in a high enough place,
mm.
you can see a tad farther than other people. And that CIA, their global news, basically agency that I worked for, sucked up the news of the world, had probably the best translation service in the world, um,
Wow.
and I saw coming very clearly what was happening with the digital revolution. How behind that, as countries digitize, you can see all this turbulence happening.
Mm,
So when I left government, I thought I want to write about this, and I did. And the book was "The Revolt to the Public and the Crisis of Authority in the New Millennium." Um, I wrote it. I tossed it into Amazon, and it kind of sat there and did okay, mediocre. And then Donald Trump came along, and
mm.
everybody goes, "Oh my goodness, this guy, he predicted this." And Trump, in the initial edition, Trump wasn't even mentioned, but somehow I predicted him. In fact, I think I provide a framework that you can understand Trump, but I did not predict him.
Mhm.
Um, then I get this call from this character, um, Patrick Collison. Who are you? And he says, no, I want to publish your book. I want to really publish your book. And I said, who is this guy? And I look him up, and he was 29 years old. He was the CEO of Stripe. And at 29, he was worth about 2 billion. I think he's worth about triple that now. All right, like we're like, oh, this guy wasn't kidding. He really does want to do this. And he published my book. This being a San Francisco Silicon Valley company, the
Mhm.
design of it, I think I get more complimented about how beautiful my book is than I do about how smart it is. Right? It's a beautiful book,
Yeah.
um, and it has had a sort of like Revolt to the Public career. It's never been reviewed by the New York Times. It's never been
Right.
reviewed by the Washington Post, but it has sold really, really well. Just through word of mouth, through podcasts like this one.
Right.
Um, it, Many people in Silicon Valley love it, and they have lots of followers. So my claim to fame is that. And I consider myself an analyst. I've always been. I was an analyst at CIA. I wrote the book from an analytic perspective, and I now write for. I guess I should say I'm a visiting fellow at Mercatus Center here in Northern Virginia, and that's what I do. I say it's like I visit every once in a while. I'm a fellow and I visit. Great people. But I do write for their very wonderful magazine Discourse. I write for
Mhm.
City Journal. I write for the New York Post. I write for Unheard. I have, you know, I write probably too much. I probably should stop myself now and then. Um, but always under the guise of trying to understand things. That's what I say. An analyst. I'm not somebody who's particularly adept at explaining to you what you should do next, but I can explain to you what you're looking at so you can understand
Yeah.
it better.
Mm.
That's me.
Yeah. Thanks for sharing that. And I was reading your recent New York Post article, which you tie in your background being from Cuba and emigrating here. So why don't we go back there first, and we'll kind of build up through your career to the book. But um,
Sure.
how did you get out of Cuba, and how did you get into the United States? And what do you remember about that time?
This is a long, long time ago. We drove to the airport, got on an airplane, and flew here. I remain, for various legalistic reasons that we need to get into here. We had American visas, United States visas to enter the country. We had visited the year before, and my mother was pregnant, as it happens, from my very youngest sister.
Mm.
And had she been born in Cuba, she did not have a visa. We would have been stuck there. So there was a rush to get us out before that
Oh,
happened.
yeah.
So I thank my parents for taking me out, but I thank my little sister, who wasn't even born then,
Mm.
for getting me out when they did. So it was not I mean, it's going from a place that you have been your kid the entire life to a place where you can't speak the language. But Cuba was very Americanized, and like all the TV shows I knew, and all the movies I knew, and the rock and roll songs I knew.
Mm.
So there was not a big culture shock, as I guess if you come from other parts of the world there might be. But it's always you leave a lot of yourself behind.
Yeah. Yeah. And you must have left a lot of family, friends there, I'm sure, right?
I left some friends. I think I've had hardly any connection with my buddies from my school and my elementary school in
Yeah.
Havana. Family, they all came over eventually. We were the
Okay.
early birds, but
Yeah.
they all came over.
Yeah. Um, how have you seen, if at all, how has the U.S. changed since you came here and your first view of it? Maybe how your parents viewed the idea of getting to America versus what it is through your CIA career, and now, like, how have you seen it change?
I mean, you could spend a lifetime talking about that.
That's
My
true.
parents, as I made clear, my father, who was a man of clear understanding
Mm.
and persuasive language, um, as I say in my New York Post story, he thought he was very grateful that given the terrible things that were happening in Cuba, this country had just opened their doors to us legally.
Mhm.
So, as I say in the article, he sat me and my sister down and said, "You are now, in somebody else's home." Right? You know how when you're
Mhm.
somebody else's home, you're supposed to be extra respectful and extra polite. That's what you're in right now. So not only you have to, abide by the laws and the customs of this place, you have to act extra respectful.
Mhm.
And lesson learned, message received. So
Mhm.
they had that attitude. I was young, and then I'm a boomer, right? I mean, boomers. So I got caught up in the '60s with. I mean, this is what you see now is not what I used to have. I had hair enough for five people, when I was about
Yeah.
20 years old. I always said back then, well, it's a good thing that I do this because someday I'm going to go bald. And I remember that, and I was right. Um,
You
so,
predicted it.
I was caught up in uh, Vietnam demonstrations, stuff like that. I sat through, I felt like I was against the war in the sense that I felt it was being fought very stupidly, right? It was
Mm.
a deceitful governments kind of manipulating people.
Yeah.
I was obviously not against fighting to protect against communism.
Mhm.
Um, but in the end, so I felt like if I was drafted, of course I was going to go. As an immigrant, I didn't feel like I could then pick and choose my duties, having having sworn to protect and defend the Constitution against all enemies,
Mhm.
foreign and domestic. So I sat through a lottery. I don't know if you know about the lottery, the
Mhm.
draft lottery. You know about that?
Mhm.
Yeah, that was Robert Kennedy, Teddy Kennedy. and they called out numbers, and the numbers were dates, and 1 through 365, and 1 through like 100, you got drafted.
Mm-hmm.
You know, 100 to like 200, you were in the middle. 200 to 365, you were safe, and I was way in the last part. But it's
Mm-hmm.
like watching your life being bargained away in this bizarre way. But and I had friends who ended up in the bad side of it. They got
Mm-hmm.
drafted. Um, but that was an alienating experience. So I went through all that. I wasn't particularly deep into drugs, but in those days, man, everybody did it. So I was there with
Mm-hmm.
that, and sort of just, I mean, the weird thing that happens in life. You say, I'm going to be totally drastically different from my parents, and in the end, you grow up and you look in the mirror and say, when the hell did I become my dad?
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, that's pretty much what happened to me. I got married. I mean, we've been married now for many, many, many years. Had 3 children. Enjoyed that. That was really the main thing I've done in my life is that those two things.
Mm-hmm.
Got married to my wife and had those 3 children. Everything else is commentary. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
but I did join the CIA, and the changes. Well, I mean, here in Virginia, the changes have been drastic. I arrived here, and I remember my sophomore year in high school was the first year that Northern Virginia schools desegregated,
Mm-hmm.
and the joke of it was that high school, Falls Church High School, where I went to, was situated in a place called Fort Buffalo, which had been historically right where the federal armies, the Union armies, had, had basically put the front with the army of Northern Virginia, and so a lot of slaves had fled and been sheltered there, right? So this is like a black area, traditionally, historically, black area for 100 years.
Wow.
Um, and the first year they allowed three black students in, and it's like, what's going on? We're in this large black community, and so they were still playing games even after they desegregated. They were still playing games. But
Yeah.
I'm here to tell you, 10 years later, it was like it had never happened.
Wow.
And you would go to, we had an apartment for a while and so forth. Then we had a townhouse, and it was like everybody from everywhere. Washington also had a big influx of immigrants. Every time a communist country got overrun, our eating got better here in Washington, right? Because all these people
Right.
would come and set up restaurants,
Yeah.
Vietnamese restaurants and so forth,
Yeah. Wow.
Ethiopian restaurants. So I think it has changed in that way. It's changed. It's gone from certainly in the South and in Virginia, from being very dominated by a particular class of people, and the vast majority of people were decent people, but those systems are hard to break. All it takes is a few thugs to intimidate you, and you back away. Virginia was not as thuggish as some, but that was always in the back.
Mm.
You can't set up a system in which people are oppressed without brute force, basically.
Mm-hmm.
But it just disintegrated in the most amazing way. I think most people just felt relief,
Wow.
right? So I've seen that change. So almost all the changes, and when I talk to young people today, I'm just kind of astounded. Almost all the changes that have happened: prosperity, affluence. I mean, middle class life. When I was in high school, and I was like middle class in my parents' little house in Falls Church, Virginia. When you back and go look at it now, it's tiny.
Mm-hmm.
It's tiny by comparison of the living spaces that somebody of that generation would have had. So everything has gotten more affluent. We've got the internet that everybody complains about, but look, we're talking.
Yeah.
We're miles away.
Yeah.
So I can go to Amazon and say I want some blue jeans, and they show up the next day.
Yeah.
So everything's gotten better. Okay, everything. The Potomac River used to be a sewer.
Mm-hmm.
You can go bass fishing. I have gone bass fishing in it now. It's lovely. You know,
Yeah.
everything's gotten better. Not everything is perfect. Not everything ever will be. Some things along the way have probably gotten worse. I've struggled to think what. I think life has gotten a lot more complicated in many ways.
Mm-hmm.
But when I talk to young people, I find it very strange because I feel like life is terrible and there's all these oppressive structures that are keeping some groups back and favoring other groups. And like systemic racism. I mean, I knew systemic racism. you
Yeah.
have to live in Jim Crow. That's systemic, and that's
Yeah.
racism, all right? Um, so what these people are talking about, I find fascinating. I mean, it's not like maybe they're right, but I don't see it.
I think, I mean, for people my generation, I'm a millennial. It's started to turn in the last, maybe it's, I'm sure it's longer, but the last 5 to 10 years, economically, the math doesn't make as much sense as it used to, and I think most of it's coming from that. So, for example, like the American dream of get a job, buy a house, have kids, retire. Um, the math of that back in the 70s or 80s was a lot different than now. I think it, and I'm making up the numbers. I don't know the exact numbers, but if it back then was like a house costs twice your income, a house now is maybe 10 times an average income. Um, so it's, and then you
Well,
come out with,
I can tell you a story. I mean,
yeah,
the first house I ever bought, inflation was 15%.
yeah,
We were paying 15% interest, and we
right.
literally had to, and we lied, by the way. Both of our bosses, we both worked, made a pittance, but both of our bosses said, "What do you want me to put down for the loan?" And they lied. They lied for us.
Hmm.
So we were supposed to be making more than we really were,
Yeah.
um, and we had to advance a day the closing for the house. It was a townhouse,
Hmm.
um, because they were going to hike interest rates the next day, and that would have put it completely out of our reach.
Hmm.
So, yeah, I mean, I the the data I look at for, I mean, the millennials, just anecdotally, my children are doing fine.
Hmm.
The Zoomers have the highest income, the highest education level of any generation ever. All right, and these are primarily, I mean, the millennials. I mean, like I said, they're my children's generation, so I take
Hmm.
you guys with a grain of salt. But you really were the last normal generation. The Zoomers have just gone off the scale in many different directions, right? But when you look at the economics of
Hmm.
the Zoomers, they are the way better than boomers, Gen Xers, and even you guys, even the millennials, in terms of both education and income levels.
The but the cost of college to get that education level has gone up significantly against the incomes, which I think is another part of it, where it's like if you go and take out debt as a Zoomer to go to college, you're paying that off until the point that would go past previous generations' time when they might buy their first house. And you're sort of like straddling these two massive debt burdens, I feel like that. um, I think that's structurally the challenge. So if the incomes are up, the houses are up more than the incomes. That would be the way I would
I
look
know
at it.
there's no question about that, but that depends on where you live too.
Of
It
course.
very much depends on where you live, and
Yeah.
I think a lot of that is kind of baked in by the governance. And I think honestly, um, I think college is probably going to, there's going to be a great fall there at some point.
Yep.
Basically, the cost of college is artificially inflated precisely because the government is going to loan you money for it. So
Yes.
basically, you're writing a blank check to the college and saying, I'm gonna ask for whatever I want, and the federal government is going to pay the bill. Except then you're going to have to pay the federal government. At some point, that racket is going to end. Already, college applications are declining pretty drastically. All right,
Mm.
something like 15-20% in the last 10 years, something like that.
Wow.
Um, so, because at the end, I mean, when you see these people who join Occupy Wall Street or something, and you listen to what they say, they go, well, I got my master's in women's studies, and
Hmm.
I can't find a job except to
Right.
babysit somebody. Um,
Hmm.
yeah. I mean, there's been the number. I think it was a one meaning, as many things are, uh, sort of projection that college is what increases income. Therefore, we should encourage people to go to college because it will increase their income. And by and large, that's probably been true. But there's a line, right?
Hmm.
There's only so many jobs that you can have at the top of the pyramid.
Yep.
And then if you are equally qualified as the people at the top, but you're not at the top and you're not making that kind of money, you feel like you invested all that money, probably had to borrow for it, and now you're stuck with the kind of job you would have had without a degree.
Right. Totally. Why don't we jump back a little bit to your time at the CIA? So did your early career at the CIA overlap with the Vietnam War at all?
No,
No.
no.
Okay, so that was
I,
like
I was a
later.
Reagan baby. I mean,
Okay.
during Jimmy Carter, CIA was just reamed.
Mm.
And when Reagan came, he said, "Come one, come all." That's probably the reason I snuck in. Okay, there was a big wave of us Reagan babies in the CIA all the way to the end of my career.
Mm.
So the Cold War was very much a thing. It was the thing. In fact,
Hmm.
there was it was um, clarity. There was a tremendous clarity of what it was that we were supposed to do, and who the enemy was, and what would happen if we didn't act in a certain way. So if we got our information wrong and so forth. I
Mm.
have to tell you, after the Soviet Union collapsed, which by the way, talking about predictions, was a complete shock inside CIA. Nobody predicted it.
Wow.
Um, it it never became quite as clear what the hell it was that we were doing in there. Obviously, there's needs for intelligence on big, potentially rival countries and so forth, but it became. I think to this day, it's who's the main threat? Was it China? Is it Russia? Is it terrorism?
Mm.
Is it all those things? Is it Iran? Who knows? Um, so there was a lot more sort of picking and choosing, and depending on what the president's particular menu was, and kind of adjusting to that, and then adjusting to events like 9/11, as opposed to no, we're here for a particular reason,
Hmm.
and we know exactly which way to go to pursue our ends. So I enjoyed my time a lot. There's some things about CIA that are not so much fun, all this reinvestigation part of it, but
Mm.
I was there basically when the internet hit, and I was there when CIA was in bad odor in Washington because they had failed 9/11, it had failed with the weapons of mass destruction in Iraq.
Mm.
So they were in an innovation thing. They were told, be innovative. And there were a few of us crazy people inside my outfit who have been saying strange things all along. So I said, well, maybe let's call them innovators, right? And so I got in the last 10 years of my life to do a lot of fun projects and to learn much of you know, what I brought out when I wrote the book.
Yeah, and that's what I wanted to ask you about is um, so what kind of work were you doing as it was a media analyst, right? As
Yeah.
your starting point, and then how did that sort of show you what your thesis became for the book?
Well, I mean, honestly, the kind of analysis I did, it was a group of us that did it. It wasn't a CIA thing.
Hmm.
But a media analyst is just that. I mean, you look at, your media inside and out. It based on propaganda analysis originally. Propaganda analysis was pretty hard for, hard in the sense of rigorous. For Russia and China, these were governments that would use certain words to mean certain things, and certain actions followed. So you
Hmm.
could literally go 20 years past and say they used those words and they invaded country X, right? So the words came up again. They're going to invade country Y. Okay, um,
Hmm.
that was true of China. That was true of Russia, and they both had ideological disputes that they did in a very veiled language show in their controlled media. That didn't work even in places like Cuba, where everything was inside the brain of Fidel Castro. It didn't work that well, so a little
Hmm.
bit with the Sandinistas in Nicaragua. But you're always looking at the media and saying, what is the source? What is the access? What is the intended audience? Why does the story come out now and why didn't it come out yesterday? Why not tomorrow? Um, what do you think is going to happen? You're sending a message. Why is this message being sent? Who is the sender? Who's behind the sender? So
Wow.
basically, it's a pretty deep analysis of not just the words and the substance, the surface substance of it, but a deep search into what is the message underneath that. All right, and my friend
Mm.
Andre Mir, whose book Post Journalism I vastly recommend, um, says that news are interesting, but fake news are more interesting. And the most interesting part of fake news is the fake part. Because anybody who's trying to straightforwardly tell you something, well, okay, that's interesting. But somebody's trying to lie to you.
Hmm.
Why is that happening? Why is this person or this messenger trying to lie to you? What is, again, what's the intent? What do they think is going to happen? Who are they aiming at? Did they hit the right target? Many times um, there's an intention and you can see it fail, right? It becomes something other than. So
Hmm.
it's a pretty in-depth analysis behind not just the words, but underneath the words. And of course,
Yeah.
with the internet, everything went crazy. You could do that in the world that I grew up in, where even a place like France, there were like two newspapers, and they were the only sources that mattered. But I saw it happen where in France, suddenly you had hundreds of thousands of websites. What am I looking at? I have no idea.
So how did that change your job when it went from a couple sources per country to completely maybe decentralized?
Well, you had these, I mean, basically, government organizations are interested in other governments. That's,
Hmm.
that's the main thing. Uh, and when you suddenly had the population, the public, erupting into the media world, which had never happened before in history. And just to give you an example, I mean, I don't speak or read Arabic, but we had translations. So we used to reading. This is the era of Hosni Mubarak in Egypt. We used to reading the Egyptian media. It was the most incredibly boring, serious. I mean, they had like a token opposition, and they had the pro Mubarak, the official newspapers. Boring, boring, boring. Absolutely humorless. And
Mm.
suddenly, these blogs start to erupt, and they were then in English because at that point they hadn't been able to use the blogging software with the Arabic script. So these were all educated Egyptians, young educated Egyptians, using blogging software and writing in English. And
Mm.
they were hilarious. They were hilarious. They were all anti-government. All the things that were not being said in the big media, these kids were saying it, and they were funny. They were
Wow.
hilarious. So you suddenly have a huge window into a society that we didn't have before, right? So it was quite a shock. The volume, I think, that if you read the book, it was by itself uh, mind numbing.
Mm.
There are people who have measured this sort of thing, and basically, the year 2001, the amount of information produced
Yeah.
was double that of all previous history, going back to the cave paintings, to the dawn of culture.
Hmm.
2002, double 2001, and it's gone on kind of like that. So if you're used to labeling, having a lot of time to kind of analyze your sources and say, well, this is authoritative, this is just a rag here. You don't bother reading that one. And suddenly you're flooded. There's no way on earth that if you had 100 years, you could look at it all. What do you do?
So do you think uh, does that job still exist at the CIA? Is it can you even do that job anymore, or is it something completely different now?
I have kind of lost. That's a really good question. I think the answer is kind of. They're still there. Um, Unfortunately, a lot of the times they're looking at the old stuff
Yeah.
because the CIA is an institution. Institutions have trouble learning new ways. So they talk a really big talk. The governments always talk a really big, we're going to digitize it, and they have no clue. They literally have no clue. So
Mm.
I don't know. I can't say because I haven't talked to any of my. I have very few people left there that I know, and I haven't talked to them recently. But it let's just say it transformed the entire job, and
Yeah.
in a way that we saw, by the way, that some of us, and we suggested that it needs to change. We needed to change, and we were not really listened to.
Mm. So I think that disruption in your job at the CIA brings us to your book. The Revolt of the Public. So I'll link to this as well. It is a
Yeah,
beautiful
there you
book,
see.
by the way.
Yep.
Um, if you don't mind, could you share, sort of in your words, the thesis of your book for people that haven't read it, as a baseline? Then I'll ask some questions after that.
Yeah, I mean, basically, when I left work, government, I told to myself, "Oh, we've been telling the CIA you should be changing your ways. Well,
Hmm.
put your money where your mouth is. Do it." I mean, I was an independent factor. I um, you know, was my own master. So I decided I'm going to do this book. Um, and when I looked, when we looked, there were several of us who were looking at this. I was the one who did the writing. Basically, what you could see was happening was that people who had never had a voice before, as I was saying in Egypt, suddenly were all over the place.
Hmm.
Suddenly we're all over the place. And just the sheer volume of information was destructive of the kind of hierarchical systems that our institutions are based on. Our institutions are all 20th century institutions. That's where they were formed, right?
Hmm.
And for those institutions to have legitimacy, they need to maintain a semi-monopoly of information. They did in the 20th century. It was a trickle. Like I said, like two newspapers in France was all you needed. Okay, we were the big information country. We had three TV stations and the New York Times and the Washington Post. Okay, and maybe Time Magazine or something. I mean, it was like
Hmm.
nothing, right? Um, so if the government had information, it was a source of authority. If the news media had information, it was a source of authority. If academia had information, it was a source of authority. I mean, basically, the public, whatever information was given to it, it was a giving, a drop of water to a person dying of thirst. You were grateful for it.
Hmm.
Um, so you had authority. You had authority. You could shape your information. I mean, think about it. John F. Kennedy apparently was a person who liked women to excess, let's put it that way. And um, not only his supporters and the media, but his political opponents all protected him. That's what he did in those days, right? There was no way you could break through to that elite world. It was a gentleman's agreement. We all keep these things to ourselves. And I mean, we didn't know that at the time. He just seemed like he had his wife and the children and whatnot. So that is what's changed. Now every elite person is surrounded by information that everything you do that is a little untoward, and many times even if it is untoward, it's just interpreted that way. It's going to reverberate this gigantic Tower of Babel effect that you get in the web. So essentially, you have had these revolt, and they're you can characterize it by type almost. There have been these revolts that started with the Arab Springs, badly named, um, and continued through in Spain with the Indignados, and then later on in France with the Yellow Vest. Here in the States, we had the Tea Party. With I think Barack Obama is part of this. He was a very digitally savvy person.
Hmm.
Um, we had Black Lives Matter. We had January 6th. We've had almost too many of these things. Um, in Chile, there's estallido social, and all over the place. You see the public basically organizing online, and they have very much the same characteristics. Every place you go to, they have very much the same characteristics, which are very different from the kind of people who were involved in trying to impose radical political change in the 20th century. I mean, in the 20th century, you basically had radical groups who had a political, they wanted to seize power first of all, or even if it was democratically, so they could impose a political program based on some ideology. The public today is indifferent to power, which is weird, and it is explicitly against organization, leadership, hierarchy, positive programs, and coherent ideologies. It's too fractured. Actually, it's too fractured. If you went to Tahrir Square in Cairo when they were protesting Mubarak, and you asked the crowd there, mostly young people, "What are you for?" you would start a fight. There were people there who were extreme socialists. There were people there who were just mainstream university students. There were people there who were Muslim Brotherhood youth. The old people stayed away, but the young people came. Anyway, they would just not agree, but they all agreed at being against Mubarak. Right?
Mm,
They all agreed in being against. The public is always against. Same thing. Famous moment for me anyway. Uh, Andrew Cuomo talking to the Black Lives Matter people in Midtown Manhattan. They had just wrecked the place. And
hmm
he told them, he says, you don't have to protest anymore. He says, you won. He said it twice, you won. And he turned to them and said, what do you want? And of course, they all hooted at him because they wanted him for him to be dead and gone and whatever, you know. The Black Lives Matter protesters were basically rooted in negation and repudiation and being against. They had no positive program. Defund the police is a slogan. They had lots of slogans. These groups have lots of wonderful slogans. I mean, the web is a gigantic factory of slogans and memes,
yeah.
but no plan, no plan. So basically, what this digital revolution has caused is public, which is very much angry, disaffected, alienated, facing these elites that they're incomprehending and absolutely. I mean, if I were to put a face on the elites, it would be Hillary Clinton, right? Somebody that she
hmm
looks and goes, "Who are those deplorables out there? And why are they? Why do they sound like that?" You know, she has no clue. She has no clue. Um, in the old days, which all of these people grew up in, nobody talked back. Everybody's talking back now.
hmm
Everybody. It's this din. Nobody can hear you, and they're going like, "We hate this." The elites hate this,
Yeah.
and they have done things like try to um, institute censorship programs on digital platforms. A desperate attempt to get back to the 20th century. Can we do that? Can we make out of the web the front page of the New York Times? No, it's not going to happen.
hmm when you said younger people or people that are protesting are indifferent to power, what do you mean by that? Because
I
it
mean,
sounds like they really don't like it. But what did you mean by indifferent to it?
different to seizing power.
Oh.
In other words, if you are a Bolshevik in 1917, if you are a Castroite in 1959, if you're a Sandinista in the 80s, um, you want to run the government, and you want to run the government because you think you have a better idea. You
hmm
have Marxism, Leninism, or whatever you want to call it. And radicals in the past, that's what they wanted. They want to take over the government so that they can implement a radical political program. That's not what happens today. I
hmm
mean, Black Lives Matter did not try to take over the government. Even January 6th, which is people call it insurgency, that's baloney. That was the same kind of thing. A bunch of incoherent gestures of opposition and negation and repudiation without anything behind it.
So why do you think that is? That they're not actually coming with a solution or trying to take the power?
Because I think one of the things that the online world does is fracture us. I mean, I think the old um, the old mass audience that I grew up being a part of was like this gigantic mirror where everybody saw themselves reflected, right? I think online
hmm
culture fractured that mirror and the public lives in all the broken pieces, okay? So as in Tahrir Square, if they said, okay, let's be positive, let's say what we want to do when we take over government, they start fighting with each other.
Mm.
There is basically no unifying thread there. The unifying thread, which can be pursued exclusively thanks to the web, because the web is this big, giant negation machine. Um, it is what you're against. So you want to vehemently demonstrate what you're against, and the more you're against, and keep your mouth shut about what you're for. And if you're a politician, you just talk in vague, drain the swamp or something that makes no sense. You don't have a program that says I'm going to do this when I take over. And then you can gather a huge host behind you of people who are very disparate and maybe even disagree with each other very much, but they all agree that they're against the thing that you're pointing to. Now, by the way, um, carried to its logical conclusion, this ends in nihilism, right? The belief that destruction is a form of progress.
So you're the way I'm thinking about it with my own opinions. It's like you're kind of
Mhm.
bringing up one thing that is a good thing, tearing down these centralized media outlets that can control the narrative and spread lies if they need to because they have control over it. Um, that's not a good thing. So that's good that the internet's destroying the media. This would be my opinion. Um, but then what you present that like essentially no one has any clue what to do next and no one can agree because there's so many different little groups of people and sort of the echo chambers on the internet, which is a bad thing. So it's kind of the internet has come through and kind of created a good thing in my view and a bad thing all at once. Where what do you think it is?
Well, I mean, I tend not to think in those terms so much because I have trouble
Mm,
trying to understand what it is, right? Whether it's
mhm.
good or bad.
Yeah.
Um, but I think one healthy way to look at it is history. History always, we're always kind of like grappling with the immediate thing. We need to, take a deep breath and stand back. It took the human race about 150 years to figure out what the hell to do with a printing press.
Mm,
Okay.
mhm,
Um, my friend and fellow Cuban, Antonio Garcia Martinez says, if you took, if you went back in time to the 30 Years War, one of the most horrible, possibly the most horrible war that Europe has experienced, including World War II,
mm,
and that was fought because I was walking around with this creed, and you were walking around with your creed, and your creed had four different words than mine. Now you had to die. Okay,
mhm,
and if you ask them, well, what do you think of the printing press? They would probably say it's the most horrible and destructive thing that has ever happened. Take it back, destroy it, burn the presses. Let's go back to the manuscripts. Nobody used to fight over those words before because nobody knew what they were, right? So it took a long time for that. We are now at the beginning, at the very, very beginning
mhm,
of a colossal transformation. Information systems are ecological forces. They change the landscape. By changing the landscape, they change the way you see things and the way you think of things and the way you behave. Okay. So we're just at the beginning of this. And, if you're me, you're a long term optimist and a short term pessimist. I think there's
mhm,
going to be a lot of bumpiness in the ride, probably for the rest of my life. I don't think I won't see the end of this. You you might, but no guarantee.
mhm,
Um, so what you have to keep in mind is let's make sure that the things that are important are there at the end, right? For me, of course, that's democracy.
mhm.
So democracy is part of these old-fashioned institutions that were shaped a certain way in the 20th century and don't seem to work in the 21st the way they are now. But in the 20th century, the democracy we had was not the democracy that the founding fathers established. It had been changed. All
Mhm.
right. We can change it again. We can adapt it to the digital age. And I think hopefully we will.
I want to ask you because so you wrote the ebook version in 2014 and updated it and published it in 2018 with Trump and Brexit, and then 2020 was the COVID stuff. So what? How um, through the lens of your thesis, how do you look at COVID, the COVID
Yeah,
story?
that's a really interesting question. I really wish I had more time to just kind of write something about that. I may someday.
Mm,
Um, okay, so the Revolt of the Public really got started way back when we tried to wave our arms and say something is coming, and people kept saying things like, "But these are a bunch of bloggers. I mean, what are they gonna do when the secret police comes? Hit them with their laptops?" They were laughing at us. And then the Arab Spring happened, right? I mean, this guy Wael Ghonim posted on Facebook that an invitation to a
mhm,
protest in Tahrir Square. 1 million users saw that invitation. 100,000 said they would attend, and we know what happened.
mhm,
So it began then. It crested in 2019. 2019, people forget, but there were like 25 to 30 major street insurgencies all over the world. All right.
mhm, mhm,
And then, of course, it stopped. And why did it stop? Well, we had this um, pandemic, which was as much a political as a health event, in my opinion. Right.
mhm,
So media at all levels, uh, basically sowed panic. Uh, the public became terrified and therefore very docile. This public that had been so mutinous and unhappy suddenly became very docile. Governments wrapped themselves up in the infallibility of science,
Yeah.
and the elites, the governments used the crisis to begin to introduce those structures of control that they had probably wanted to put in all along, right?
Yeah.
Serious, amazingly, amazing for American government to be doing something like this. Serious, people get the White House calling people to get them booted out of um, social media messages being pulled at the request of the FBI by the hundreds of thousands. Okay, and it started, of course, with the best of intentions. Yet again, it's like, well, you don't want some crazy person who's saying, "Take my magic elixir and you'll be cured of COVID," to be spreading bad medicine around. Um, but that pretty quickly went into, well, anybody who disagrees with us about what the right policies are, and policies should always be debatable, should be blocked. And then
Hmm.
it becomes like, well, those people are bad people anyway, so they should be blocked. And so you have this very partisan, at the end, it was the Democratic Party and the progressives and people who believed that identity was you could harm somebody by saying that the wrong pronouns, for example. So it's
Hmm.
almost like a health issue. And yet these tremendous controls applied during that moment. That lasted for as long as the public was scared. At that moment, my friend David Goodhart is a British writer and thinker, called it the hour of the state. And he told me it was happening, it was coming. I said, I don't think so. He was right.
Mm.
But that hour is over, and that hour is over because the public isn't afraid anymore, and the political consequences of that lack of fear are already visible. I mean, for God's sakes, Trump is leading in the polls. I mean,
Hmm.
Trump has never led in the polls ever in my
Right.
memory. All right.
Right.
So that's to be a great big signal that the public has lost a sense of, no, we gotta listen to what the elites are saying. We've got to allow all those constraints are being taken to court. They've all been, the Twitter files were an amazing
Yeah.
act of journalism by Barry Weiss, Matt Taibbi,
Hmm.
and Michael Schellenberger, who are wonderful humans. Um, so this is now disintegrating. You look around the world, people like Javier Milei, a libertarian, anarcho-libertarian, gets elected president
Hmm.
of Argentina, the land of Juan Perón. Insane.
Mm.
Um,
Yeah.
Geert Wilders wins an election in Holland. Um, there are many parties, populist, you would call them, parties in Europe that have been untouchable, very pariah parties, who are now leading in the polls. So I think the public is not afraid anymore. So my thesis went through a reactionary moment when the elites, who have been reactionary all along, I mean, that's
Yeah.
been their posture. That's
Hmm.
the deplorable mindset. It's like we've got to do something about these deplorables.
Yeah.
Um, it's but at that moment they were given the tools. They were given science. I mean, I have several quotations. Fauci saying, "I represent science."
Right.
Um, the head of communications at the United Nations saying, "We own the science." You're going like,
Yeah. Trust.
that's like
Trust the
so
science.
unscientific to say that, right?
Yeah, it's an oxymoron. Trust the science is an
Yeah,
oxymoron. It's essentially
yeah.
science is not trusting what currently is believed about a topic. It's
I mean, that's what
yeah.
Karl Popper said, and he's my authority on this. All right.
Mm.
I mean, basically, in the open society, everything is questioned.
Hmm. I want to ask you about one more thing. Um, so I don't even know if we've mentioned it, but you've called this the fifth wave,
Mm,
sort of the internet.
right.
Um, so do you think the AI stuff is that a sixth wave? Because that's almost a whole new leap forward for me from just the internet. So like the internet, I would view as people being able to spread their views much more efficiently, whereas AI is computers sharing their views or creating views or creating things. So how, AI in my own personal life for my work, it's been like the last year and a half that I've really actually been able to use it. And so in my mind, the AI thing kind of just truly is becoming pervasive. So how does that change things? That there's going to be
That's a
machines writing
gigantic.
things.
It's a gigantic question. I honestly think it's too early to tell, but I think you're
Yeah,
right. I mean, it
of
has the
course.
potential to be a six before we even have adopted and adjusted to the fifth wave, which is the
Yeah.
internet, the digital world. We're
Hmm.
now being thrown a sixth thing that seems, I may be wrong because it's early and it hasn't played out yet, but it seems different. It's
Hmm.
different from the internet. This is not the same
Yeah.
thing. This is not Internet Plus. This is a completely different qualitative thing. So it has the potential to be
Yes.
that, and there's a lot of potential for good. As with all these transformations, and a lot of potential for bad, for strange things to happen. Um, but it's too early. I
Yeah.
would anybody who understands history knows that it doesn't play out in a year or two. It plays out in decades. So let's wait and see.
Yep. We will leave it there. If people want to follow you, Martin, where on the internet should they go?
Yeah, I'm on. I guess it's called now X. I mean, I'm mostly an admirer of Elon Musk, but I hated that he changed the name of Twitter. It was much simpler when you said Twitter,
Me
right?
too.
So, and the little black X of his looks like a pirate. I
Yeah.
guess that's what he thinks is cool. Um, anyway, yeah, I'm on X/Twitter, and that's mainly the place. I mean, I'm on
Okay.
Facebook, but that's mainly friends and family.
Okay. I'll include a link to your Twitter account, a link to the
Okay,
book, in the description.
great,
And yeah, I really appreciate you taking the time to talk with me today.
fun talk.